Hello again everybody and welcome back to the Welsh Lady ASMR. Today is going to be another softly spoken video and I'm going to tell you a little bit about, guess what? Yeah, another book. But this one's relevant because I was actually away last week with my husband. We went to Oxford, caught the train to Oxford, and we walked on the Thames Path over 5 days, 4 nights, and ended up in Henley on Thames, got the train home. Now, we started this little adventure 2 years ago. 2 years ago. We caught the train to a little station in Gloucester called Pangbourne. And that is very close to where the source of the Thames River starts. When we did it 2 years ago, for the first day, we hardly saw any water at all. The Thames doesn't really start, at least the time of year we went. It was 2 years ago in September. Most of day one was the odd puddle here and there and an odd ditch, and it wasn't really until day 2 that we started to see a little stream, and then over the course of 4 days until we got to Oxford it got bigger and bigger, became navigable, and then lots of pleasure boats and canal boats, etc. So this time we started in Oxford and ended up in Henley, and obviously the Thames has become much bigger. So I've got the guidebook with me, the Thames Path. This one is called Thames Path in the Country by David Sharp and Tony Gowers. And it is in the series of the official National Trail Guide. And for the Thames Path itself, there are 2 guides in this series. This one goes from the source to Hampton Court, and then there's another guidebook which covers from Hampton Court. I'm not sure if it's up to the barrage or whether it goes beyond that. I don't have that guidebook as yet. I've just got this one. Now, the walk we did 2 years ago, I have done 2 videos on YouTube on my other channel, which is called The Importance of Being. That's not an ASMR channel. It's mainly about my trips, camping, campervanning and walking, etc. And I will link it in the description of this video if you're interested in seeing it. And then the video for the trip we did last week will be coming out on YouTube on the importance of being in the next few days. I've just got to finish editing it. So if you're interested in the Thames Path and how me and Richard got on, then head over there. As I say, I will link them below. But for this video, for this channel, which is ASMR, I am simply going to talk about the guidebook itself and tell you a little bit from the guidebook on each day from last week. Each day, the route, how many miles, and a little bit about the towns and villages that we passed through. So I hope you find it interesting. If you're not interested in walking or the Thames Path, I hope you find the tone, etc. relaxing. Anyway, do let me know in the comments if you enjoy walking, if you've done any of the national trails here in the UK. Richard and I want to complete this. We're hoping to finish it next year, but we've got so many other national trails that are adding to an ever-growing list because we really love the walking with a purpose and changing where we stay every night. So more walks will be coming. But let's get started on the Thames Path Guide from source to Hampton Court. I am going to put my reading glasses on as I am struggling a little bit, it seems, as time goes on. Reading books is becoming more difficult, so yeah, I'm at that age. So I'm going to read, as usual, from the back to tell you a little bit about the book and what you could expect inside here. Rising in rural Gloucestershire, winding through Oxfordshire, past the pageantry of Royal Windsor, to dive into the hubbub of the metropolis, the Thames is truly a mighty river, and the long-distance footpath that follows its bank all the way from its source is one of Britain's most varied and accessible national trails. This official guide takes you the full length of its country section, from the river's rise south of Cirencester, nearly 150 miles to Hampton Court, in brackets, from where a companion volume, Thames Path in London, takes over. In its western stages, the path is an idyllic stroll among tranquil meadows, with rowers and swans for companions. Nearer London, it visits handsome and vibrant towns like Abingdon, Henley and Marlow. Throughout its length, as this compendious and engrossing book shows, a walk along the Thames Path is a journey through history, just as much as landscape, taking in everything from Oxford University to MG Cars, and from Eton College to the artist Stanley Spencer or the Cliveden set. Routes are split into convenient day walk sections, transport links for start and finish of each stage, circular walks around Oxford and Windsor and Eton. It has the OS 1 in 25,000 maps throughout and comprehensive information on the history, wildlife and places of interest. The book is looking a little worn. It has now done 2 weeks with me and Richard in our rucksacks, and while we were away we read it umpteen times a day just to get our bearings, check the maps, etc. And as I said, we have done from the source to Oxford 2 years ago. I'm not going to read parts of that because this video will just go on too long. I'm going to read, as it's so fresh in my memory, the areas, the days that we did last week, which was from Oxford to Henley on Thames. Okay, so I was having some trouble booking accommodation for our first night. Well, our first night was actually spent in Oxford. As I say, we caught the train and we had one day to wander around Oxford and look at all the gorgeous dreaming spires and universities, etc. But the walk-in actually began on the Tuesday, and our first walk should have been, according to this guidebook, should have been from Oxford to Abingdon, and according to this book that would have been 9 3/4 miles or 15.6 kilometres. Now the problem was I couldn't find any accommodation in Abingdon, so I booked a small hotel B&B just outside Abingdon in a place called Culham, which was off the path, about a mile off the path. But it meant that our second day then was a little shorter than this guidebook, but only by a mile or two. But anyway, I'm going to stick to the book and read you a general description of the walk from Oxford to Abingdon. This short section of the Thames Path allows some time to explore Oxford, although you will need at least a day to do it any justice. There is a walk suggested on another page in the book. Beyond the surprisingly rural suburbs of Oxford and the brief intrusion of the Oxford bypass, you will again pass through quiet and empty countryside, with Sandford-on-Thames as the only settlement of any size between Oxford and Abingdon. After separating into channels through Oxford, the river now rejoins and has grown in size as it heads southwards on a long, gentle curve towards Abingdon. You will pass Sandford Lock, the largest lock on the Thames, and its associated weir known as the Sandford Lasher, which has claimed many lives. The historic riverside town of Abingdon is a fitting end to this section. And as I say, there are little cuts of the OS maps here. Richard took photos of these and referred to his phone throughout the day. And the book sort of gives you little descriptions of every couple of miles what you're going to see, and off-path directions for things like pubs, cafes, facilities, etc. So that was day one. And if you are in Oxford, there is a map in here, a circuit around Oxford with all the various universities and sites that you're going to see. So we're moving on to day 2 of the walk, which for us was Wednesday last week. This is Abingdon to Wallingford, but we were a little further on to start. We were in just outside Culham, so we joined more or less at Culham itself. But from the guidebook, Abingdon to Wallingford is 13.5 miles or 21.7 kilometres. This scenically rewarding and varied section both starts and finishes in very attractive and historic riverside towns. Abingdon and Wallingford merit time to explore their fascinating back streets and old buildings. The route is dominated by great loops in the river and fascinating small settlements along the way. Two particular highlights are the wonderful juxtaposition of Clifton Hampden Bridge with the nearby church and the varied landscapes around Little Whittenham. The springy turf and the long, slow loop of the river from Clifton Hampden Bridge to Days Lock make exhilarating walking. Apart from a short section of road walking near Shillingford, this is a magnificent towpath walking at its best. Try to allow time to visit the ancient Abbey of Dorchester. I hadn't realised that there was another town called Dorchester in England. I knew there was one in Dorset, but this Dorchester sounds very historic as well. I think before we set off on this adventure last week, we looked at the guidebook, and I know I was very keen, I think Richard was as well, to do all the little detours and call in and see the Abbey at Dorchester and to explore all the places we were staying in overnight. The fact was, when we were actually walking all these miles per day, by the time we came to our hotel, B&B, etc., we were simply too achy and tired and walked out to really do much exploring. So we pretty much stuck to the path got to our accommodation, went out for a drink, something to eat. But really that was really as much as the exploring as we did. So we haven't really seen any of the sites suggested other than the ones that were visible from the path. But we did stay in Wallingford, and that was a lovely medieval town, and we did walk that evening as far as the Waitrose to get some snacks. But Wallingford, beautiful town. Day 3 of our walk was from Wallingford to Tilehurst. At least this is what the guidebook has. Once again, I couldn't find anywhere in Tilehurst, so we ended up staying in Pangbourne, which actually was only probably 2 miles short. But this Wallingford to Tilehurst, as suggested in the guide, was 14 3/4 miles, or 23.6 kilometres. We actually only did 12 miles this day, which meant that we added another 2 miles to the following day, which we'll come to in a second. But I'll read you the overview of this walk from the book. This attractive and varied section starts in the old riverside town of Wallingford and passes through the Goring Gap, the dramatic valley carved by the River Thames through the line of chalk hills. It is the only section of the walk with anything like a serious hill, with one climb and one steep descent to negotiate through typical Chiltern countryside. The beech woodlands on this walk can look stunning on a crisp, sunny autumn day, and you may well be accompanied overhead by circling red kites. We saw loads of red kites. The regularity of rail connections allows greater flexibility to plan walks in this area. The final approaches to Tilehurst are quite a contrast, being much more urban in parts. At Streatley, this section of the Thames Path crosses another long-distance route, the Ridgeway National Trail. This was a lovely day, and yes, there was a steep hill, or rather steep for the Thames Path, because up to this point there's barely been any inclines. It's delightfully flat, but yeah, there was quite a hill, but it was through gorgeous woodlands, and you could see the river down below, and it was a stunning day, probably my favourite day on the Thames Path in all of the walks that we've done. As I say, we stayed in Pangbourne. The guidebook does have a little paragraph on Pangbourne, which I will read you. We stayed in a very old coaching inn, and the bedroom we had the original oak beams, very quirky, very lovely. This is what the guidebook has to say. Pangbourne, a large village on the Thames. Pangbourne has many literary associations. Kenneth Grahame, author of The Wind in the Willows, retired here, where he died in 1932. And the Swan Public House is where an exhausted Jerome K. Jerome ended his 3 men in a boat experience. More modern, I suppose, when we did on this particular day, we passed through Goring-on-Thames, beautiful village beside the river. And it's in Goring-on-Thames that the pop star George Michael lived in his later years. And you pass his actual house, or rather the rear of his house, and there are sort of permanent memorials, flowers, little wooden hearts on ribbons. So you really can't miss that. But that was day 3. The final day of our walk, anyway, should have been Tilehurst to Henley on Thames. which was 12.25 miles or 19.7 kilometres. But as I said earlier, we didn't walk as far as Tilehurst the day before. We were about 2 miles short. But somehow, I'm not quite sure how, I think there was a detour on the Thames Path, because when we looked at our mileage on our watches, we actually did 18 miles this day, which was our last day, and it was a very hot day, and we really felt that 18 miles, we've agreed, is too far for us to do in one day, even though the path was fairly flat again. In the heat as well, it was simply too far, and we were absolutely exhausted when we got to Henley. Fortunately, it was our last day, although we did notice after a good long sleep in the morning, we felt fine again. We could have gone walking again, but it was our last day. So on the last day, before catching our train home, we did a little explore around Henley, which is a beautiful, beautiful town again. And it was the week after the regatta, but there were still some celebrations going on the night we stayed, and fireworks, and lots of people dressed up to go to a black tie ball. So very interesting. And we stayed in a horse box, actual working horse box. I booked it on booking.com, and it was a convenient place to stay. But I did find out that there was a Wetherspoons on the high street, which was a gorgeous Wetherspoons. They were old again, coaching in, which had accommodation. So when we go back, we're going to stay there because it looked amazing. But I will read you from the guidebook the route from Tilehurst to Henley on Thames. This section of the Thames Path is again very varied as it passes through the large urban centre of Reading on a surprisingly leafy route. It also takes in some quiet countryside and an area of flooded gravel pits. Highlights include the Sonning area and the exciting approach to Henley-on-Thames, passing the river and rowing museum, a must-visit for any Thames Path walker. The train links at Shiplake and Henley give you an opportunity to plan shorter circular walks. You may spot red kites on this section, soaring majestically above the Thames Valley. I think we saw red kites absolutely every day. Beautiful birds. So yeah, that was our final day. And yes, this is the photo in the book of the outskirts of Reading, which is an excellent representation. It was a lovely little skirt around the city of Reading, and some lovely parks and areas beside there. And as I said, there was a bit of a detour on this section. And yeah, we just ended up, as I said, 18 miles. But Henley, beautiful, definitely. There's a photograph in the guidebook of Henley, or part of Henley. You've got the riverside section with all the boats, and there were a lot of boats there because, as I said, it was the remnants of the Henley regatta. But you've also got quite a busy sort of town with all of your major bars, restaurant chains, as well as independent ones as well. And that is where we will be starting our walk when we do the next leg, which, as I said, is probably going to be next year now. But when I come back from any walking trip, I initially it's lovely to have a rest your legs, etc. But I start missing the path, and once again, reading the guidebook again is bringing back lovely memories from last week. So as I say, if you are interested, the video for this trip will be up in the next day or two. The link will be below as soon as I get the video out. And just as a teaser, there is on our final day a bit of drama because we get chased by bulls. So check it out on the other channel, The Importance of Being. But meanwhile, I hope you enjoyed this week's video, and I look forward to seeing you again. Take care, everyone. Bye.